He may no longer be the number one prospect in baseball, but Jackson Holliday is certainly a gigantic part of the Orioles' future. So, what has he learned from year one, and what can he do in year two with the Orioles? We'll talk about that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, March 6th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to do our final season review episode of the offseason. Remember, I started at the beginning of the offseason, basically taking almost every player on the Orioles 40-man roster who was going to be back in 2025 and did a full review of their 2024 season and then their outlook for 2025. And the last player to get to is Jackson Holliday, and that's who we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about what went right in his first year in the big leagues as he got his feet wet. He knew what he needed to work on. We'll talk about what went wrong, the struggles he had at the plate that left him on the outside looking in when the Orioles were playing down the stretch and into the postseason. And finally, we'll talk about Jackson's biggest storylines heading into 2025. Is the second base job his? And what steps does he need to take to break out fully this year? But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We are free and available on all podcast listening platforms. You can check us out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Leave us a 5-star rating and a review. Subscribe wherever you listen. It really, really helps out the show. And of course, we're here on YouTube as well. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And if you have any thoughts about the show, want to get some mailbag questions in, want to talk baseball, whatever it is, you can always email me at lockedonorioles@gmail.com. But let's jump right into our final 2024 season recap. We took until March 6th, but we did it 3 weeks before opening day. Got them all done. Very happy about that. And today it is Jackson Holliday, the Orioles' 21-year-old phenom who certainly didn't light the world on fire in his first big league season last year. Jackson Holliday, after debuting in April of last season, ended up playing in 60 big league games for the Orioles at age 20 in 2024. In 208 plate appearances, he hit 189 with a 255 on base and a 311 slugging, had 5 home runs, stole 4 bases, a 7% walk rate to a 33% strikeout rate. That all added up to a 63 WRC plus on the season, meaning he was 37% worse than the league average hitter in his 60 games he played in last year. So let's start with what went right for Jackson Holliday last year. And I think the big overarching thing you have to talk about first is that he got himself to the big leagues. That is certainly something that went right. And when you think about the timeline that he went on, it is pretty impressive that it took him less than 2 years as a high school draft pick to make it to the major leagues. Remember, the Orioles took Holliday first overall out of high school in Oklahoma in the 2022 MLB draft. And on April 10th of 2024, he debuted in the major leagues at age 20. That is very, very hard to do. No matter if you're the 1-1, anybody who debuts at 20, it is special. And now it did come with some kind of odd circumstances because Holliday, it seemed like the Orioles had an opening. He was very good in spring training last year, and it seemed like Holliday was going to make the opening day roster. And Mike Elias and the Orioles never guaranteed it was going to happen, but kept saying there was a path for Holliday to get there. And then it didn't happen. And not only did the Orioles decide to begin Jackson Holliday in AAA Norfolk, but instead of just choosing an internal candidate to take his roster spot, they signed veteran Tony Kemp, of course, another left-handed hitting second baseman, to a 1-year major league deal and threw him on the roster instead of Holliday. Kemp, who it was a signing right before opening day, basically. Like, he wasn't even in camp for that long with the Orioles. It was kind of an odd decision. And Kemp didn't really play a whole lot. He ended up going 0 for 9 with a walk and a strikeout in an Orioles uniform, and then was DFA'd when Holliday was finally called up. But it was a little interesting. Now, Jackson was called up on April 10th to join the Orioles in Boston and make his major league debut, and that is when Kemp got the DFA. But what the Orioles said about the reasoning for this weird, 2-week delay to bring him up did make some sense. They claimed, at least Mike Elias did, that it was because the Orioles were facing so many left-handed starting pitchers to begin the year. And they wanted to, early in his career, kind of hide Jackson as a left-handed hitter from left-handed pitching and only have him face righties. And they said they felt he wasn't going to have a good enough chance to help the roster in that first week and a half. Now, Tony Kemp is also a left-handed hitter, so it didn't make as much sense, but you could weigh it in a little bit more when you realized, okay, you have Westberg, you have Ramon Arias, you're going to play those guys, Ryan Mountcastle, and Holliday was going to sit. And it did make sense because 5 of the Orioles' first 9 games of the season last year, they faced a left-handed starting pitcher. And I think overall in the season, the Orioles faced 40-something lefties in their 162 games. So to face 5 in a 9-game stretch is quite a large number of left-handers to go up against. It was pretty abnormal to begin the season like that. And Jackson Holliday was called up for game number 10. So they did 5 out of 9 against lefties. He came up and he was in the starting lineup in that 10th game. And that began a stretch after that where in 8 of the Orioles' next 9 games, they faced a right-handed starting pitcher. And they felt that was when Jackson Holliday fit the roster better. And I did think, I will say, when they sent him down, it was going to be some service time manipulation. They were going to wait like the 3 weeks, call him up in late April, get that extra year of service time. But they did call him up April 10th. And had he stayed on the roster the entire year, which he did not, the Orioles, it really wouldn't have been manipulating that service time when you still call him up that early. It seemed to be that it was genuinely just to hide him from all those lefties and then get him to the big leagues when they faced the righties. And they kept their word. I mentioned that, in the next 9 games, they faced 8 righties. Jackson was in the starting lineup in all 8 of those games. The only day he had off was against that one left-handed starting pitcher that they faced in that stretch. So it kind of came to fruition that they weren't really lying to us. It seemed like an odd decision for just 9 games of a 162-game season to send a guy to AAA, but they had a plan and they executed it. Now, the Orioles did also, in terms of what went right, they gave him at least an early chance. Like, after he got called up, the next 10 games in which the Orioles faced a right-handed starting pitcher, Jackson Holliday was in the lineup. And I think we all knew they were going to hide him from lefties early. And I was generally fine with that decision. Like, the first 4 lefties that were on the mound when he was up in the big leagues, Jackson Holliday was not in the starting lineup. They gave him the chance. It just wasn't pretty when he was out there. We'll certainly get to that in the second segment, but they gave him that early chance. Now, you could argue that maybe it wasn't long enough of a chance because, he was sent down 2.5 weeks after he was called up. But he did come back later in the season. Jackson Holliday, after going down to AAA and getting injured in Norfolk for a bit, he came back on July 31st, and it was quite a pop to return to. He hits a grand slam at Camden Yards against the Blue Jays for his first career homer in his first game back in the bigs. And you're like, okay, Jackson, maybe going down there really did help him out. And through the ups and downs he went through, he did remain on the big league roster for the rest of the season. He was recalled July 31st. And although he wasn't playing every single day for the rest of the year, he was on the roster. And in that time, it still wasn't good. It was a 218, 285, 365 slash line with an 87 WRC plus. It was much better than the first stretch, but he was still a well below average hitter. But he also did post a 46.2% hard hit rate and an 8.5% barrel rate. Good numbers. To put that hard hit rate into context, if Holliday were a qualified hitter, it would have put him top 50 among all hitters in Major League Baseball. For more context, Jordan Westberg and Colton Cowser each had a 46.1% hard hit rate last year. So basically equal to what Jackson did. And those 2 players were an all-star and the guy who should have won AL Rookie of the Year, respectively. And if you rank his hard hit rates among second basemen, if you compare him to his peers, only Ketel Marte, who was an MVP candidate in the National League on the Diamondbacks, had a better hard hit rate among all second basemen than Jackson Holliday in 2024. So there were definitely some things to like, despite the fact that the stats didn't look amazing. And to put his barrel rate into perspective, 8.5%. Jose Ramirez, top 15 at worst, probably top 10 player in the league, 8.6% barrel rate. There are guys who run those rates and are super, super successful. And although he did have to play against some lefties, Jackson did down the stretch, and that didn't go super well. From July 31st on, in that second stint, when he was facing right-handers, which is who the Orioles wanted him to face, he did have a 104 WRC plus. He was 4% better than a league average hitter at age 20 when facing righties. Basically, he was a playable, solid hitter against right-handers down the stretch. And it's tough to realize that because the stats still don't look great, but he was playable. And like the Orioles gave him a chance again. Now they were kind of forced into it because the day he got recalled, he came up because Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers were traded. So Jackson Holliday came onto the roster. Then the day he was called up was when Jordan Westburg was hit by a fastball and broke his hand. So all of a sudden the Orioles needed an infielder. They had just called up Holliday and it was like, well, he's going to be in the lineup every single day for now. And he was kind of that direct replacement. So not only was he playing against righties, he had to play against lefties. After the call-up, because of the Westburg injury, Jackson Holliday started 22 consecutive games for the Orioles. He was basically hitting 7th, 8th, or 9th, playing second base for 22 straight games. And in 7 of those games, there was a left-handed starter on the mound for the opponent. And it didn't matter. The Orioles were so injured and struggling at that point, they kind of didn't have anyone else to turn to. And that's a weird thing to say about your number one prospect who's now in the big leagues, but he wasn't exactly lighting the world on fire, but there wasn't a lot of better options. So he got thrown into that fire. And then after 22 straight days, Jackson got 1 day off against a left-handed pitcher. And then he was right back in there for 13 more consecutive games. He was in the starting lineup and there were 3 more lefties in there. They just had to play him. And again, it didn't all go amazing, but he got a lot of the bad stuff, I hope, behind him, just being thrown into that fire when maybe he wasn't 100% ready. But in that second half of the season, they just needed a skilled, talented body out there with the injuries. And that is who they went with. And again, he was playable against righties. The defense and speed showed up. There were a couple rough plays at second base, but otherwise he was +1 and outs above average. He was an above average defender. He had a 95th percentile sprint speed and was 4 for 4 stealing bases. To put his sprint speed into perspective, it is equal to Estuary Ruiz, the outfielder for the Athletics, who is basically just known at this point for his speed and stealing bases. Holliday had equal sprint speed to a guy who was known at one point as like the fastest player in the minor leagues. That is how much he can get around the bases, and he got faster this offseason, which we'll talk about. So I know the stats don't look good, but there were some things to really build on, and hopefully a lot of things that Holliday learned from this season. But when you learn a lot from a season, that is generally something that people say when on paper you had some struggles. And certainly on paper, I've already talked about the stats, there were struggles. So let's dive into what really, really hurt Jackson in that first big league season. That is coming up next. So for Jackson Holliday, we know there were struggles. I mentioned he had a 63 WRC plus. He was worth 0 WAR at Fangraphs. Like it wasn't a great debut for him. So let's go to what went wrong for Holliday in season number 1 of the bigs. First thing is those first 2 weeks, it was tough to watch. It was very exciting to see him called up. He didn't get a hit, but he did drive in a run in his first game at Fenway Park. That was very exciting. And then it was just like, wow, this is getting tough. Took him a while to get that first hit until he did on that Sunday against Milwaukee. He ended up going 2 for 34. Both hits were singles with 18 strikeouts and just 2 walks and that 1 RBI with a 38% hard hit rate in that first stretch of games. Now, he was only playing against righties. The Orioles were completely hiding him from left-handed pitching. But still, he just kind of looked lost. And that's not horrible, right? He was 20 years old, less than 2 years removed from being drafted out of high school. Like he had barely played a lot in the minor leagues. You're knowing that guys like that, even a guy who's the number 1 prospect of baseball, are going to take some lumps in the majors. It's just going to happen. But it seemed like even when you compare it to Adley, who struggled early, and Gunnar, who struggled early, and Colton Cowser, who struggled early, like Jackson's struggles felt like they were on a higher level. And that is probably because he was younger than a lot of those guys when he got to the big leagues and just didn't have as much experience. And the difference also was, with Cowser and with Gunnar and with Adley struggling early, the Orioles were in a position then where they could afford to have a couple of guys struggle like that, knowing they'd be long-term fits. The Orioles in this 2024 season, coming off the AL East championship and then flaming out in the playoffs, they were locked even early in the year, knowing in a tight battle with the Yankees, they're trying to win a World Series. You can't have a black hole in your lineup for that long. And they tried to balance, I think, that decision of, well, we need to give him a runway. We need to give Jackson a chance to get his feet wet and get his feet under him in the big leagues. But also, we can't have an 0 for 4 with 2 strikeouts every single night when we put him in there. It's not good for the team. And it's probably not good for his confidence either if that keeps happening. Maybe he needs a reset. And at that point, the Orioles were like, we could either demote him to the bench and play him a little bit, or we could send him to AAA and play him every day. And because they realized, because of his struggles, hey, he still has some things to work on, I think the thinking was we'd rather have him playing every single day, getting regular at-bats in AAA, than playing 2 times a week in the majors and being a bench player. You see that a lot with top prospects who are struggling. Teams would rather just send them back to AAA for a reset than sit them on the bench for a bit. And so 16 days after he was called up on April 26th, he was sent back to AAA Norfolk. And there were some things to work on. He was struggling with high fastballs. They weren't really ready to put him in there against lefties at all. His swing mechanics and timing were a little bit off. But he also suffered an elbow injury when he got back down to AAA. He went on the IL in Norfolk on June 14th after playing a good chunk of time down there. And it was only 11 days he was out. He returned off the injured list on June 25th. But for a while after coming off the IL, he still wasn't playing the field. He was DHing for a while. The Orioles were waiting, being cautious to make sure the elbow was okay to throw the ball from shortstop and second base playing defensively. So that put a little rut into his season in the middle and the things that he was working on. And quite honestly, if the O's had not traded Connor Norby and not had Ramon Arias and Jordan Westburg go down with injuries, who knows if they would have recalled Jackson Holliday. Now, I think eventually maybe for a September call-up, they still might have brought him back. But he was somewhat forced back to the big leagues on July 31st when he came back. And when he did come back, like, it still wasn't amazing. I mentioned the progress that he made and how the stats across the board got better. But you're still looking at an 87 WRC plus from July 31st to the end of the season. And that's really why he wasn't a factor at the very end of the year. Like, he was playing and he was holding his own somewhat because the Orioles were so injured and Westburg and Arias were out. Norby was traded and they didn't have these other guys. They were playing a lot of Emmanuel Rivera. That's kind of where the Orioles were, even though Rivera was hitting much better than Holliday was. Levon Soto was getting some at-bats. But as soon as Westburg and Arias came off the injured list, they both were put back in the lineup on September 22nd, late in the year. That was pretty much it for Jackson Holliday. Once Westburg and Arias came back, Holliday did not play in another meaningful game, at least as a starter, for the remainder of the season. He was like a glorified pinch runner that the Orioles had on the bench after the 22nd when those 2 starters came back. The only time he was in the lineup for the remainder of the year, including the postseason, was September 28th. It was the penultimate game of the season. It was the day after the Orioles had won that Friday night game in the final series in Minnesota and then had clinched everything. They'd clinched a playoff spot. They'd clinched hosting the first round of the wild card, and they literally had nothing more to play for in the final 2 games. So they gave guys a rest, and they started Holliday at shortstop and hit him lead off and had Gunnar Henderson take a day off. And that was the only other time Holliday was in the lineup. Now, he did go 3 for 4 with a double, 2 walks, and 3 hard hit balls and looked amazing in that game in Minnesota. Now, the Twins were also eliminated as well, so they weren't really playing for anything. And it's kind of a weird scene, those final 2 games between the Orioles and the Twins. But he was showing off the new toe tap approach in his swing. He was crushing the baseball. He looked really, really good. But at that time, it was not crazy that the Orioles were playing Jordan Westburg and Ramon Arias over Holliday. I mean, Arias had been, before he twisted his ankle, he had been the Orioles' best hitter in August while everybody else was slumping. We know how important Jordan Westburg as an all-star last year was to this team. So when those 2 came back to go along with, of course, your MVP candidate, Gunnar Henderson, in the infield, there just wasn't a lot of space to play Jackson Holliday with the way he was producing versus the way Arias, Westburg, and Henderson were producing. And I don't think there were a lot of people that were really screaming for Holliday to be back in there over Ramon Arias, just because Arias was producing, Holliday wasn't. The team was struggling, and they needed something to get going in the postseason. And so Holliday, didn't appear as a hitter in those postseason games. And obviously it's ironic because the O's scored 1 run total in the 2 games, and maybe Holliday could have provided a spark that the other guys didn't, but he wasn't really hitting throughout the year. He kind of ran out of time to prove himself, and the O's just had to go another way as they were getting close to October. And really the other thing that stood out that went wrong down the stretch was, I mentioned the Orioles gave him a chance against lefties because they had to, right? They were without Arias, they were without Westburg. they were playing everybody they had. And so Holliday was in there against a good chunk of left-handed pitchers in August and the early part of September. And the O's gave him a chance. And you could kind of see the reasons why early in the year they completely hid him from lefties, because it was ugly. I mean, I remember there was that game, I believe it was in August against the Blue Jays. It was right around when Holliday had first come back up. He was really swinging it well that first week or so when he came back to the big leagues after the Grand Slam. And there was the day I thought the entire Orioles online fan base was going to turn against Brandon Hyde, when in the 8th inning of a close game, Orioles were down by a couple of runs. He pinch hit Austin Slater for Jackson Holliday against a left-handed reliever. Now, Slater actually did his job. He drew a walk and got on base to lead off that inning, but people were up in arms because Jackson was swinging the bat well, but it was like, hey, he's just not still giving us anything against lefties. And that played out in the statistics. Like, you look overall, and Slater was pretty good against lefties before he joined the Orioles and when he was with the Orioles. And you look back on it and what Holliday did against lefties, it was like the O's were down 3. They needed base runners. Austin Slater got on base in that spot, and he gave the Orioles against a lefty a better chance to get on base. Holliday, down the stretch, after not facing a lefty the whole time, he went 4 for 40 against left-handed pitching. He did hit a home run, but it was 16 strikeouts to 2 walks and a 39% swing and miss rate. And those 4 hits all came in those first 2 weeks he was back in the big leagues, when he was swinging the bat really well, when he was in the lineup every day. He finished the season 0 for his final 23 with 12 strikeouts against left-handed pitching. Like, Hyde's decision was kind of vindicated. Holliday was just not ready to face lefties in the big leagues, and the Orioles needed guys who could, and that's why they had Emmanuel Rivera, and that's why they had Austin Slater, just getting guys in there who could at least give you something against left-handed pitching. And lefties mostly threw him sliders. He did not get a hit against a lefty slider. He had a 54% swing and miss rate against lefty sliders. That is ridiculous. That was just kind of the easy way for lefties to get him out. Now, he did do pretty well against left-handed fastballs, which is always good. If you're behind lefty fastballs, you got an even larger hill to climb. And his one left-on-left fastball did come off a sinker from the Rays lefty Tyler Alexander in August, and that was a good swing he made on a pitch down the middle. But there were clearly issues with whiffs, clearly issues with squaring the ball up against lefties, and sometimes even in general. But I think across the board, it just kind of looked like a 20-year-old who wasn't fully ready. And the Orioles knew that when they sent him down the first time, but with all the injuries they had, they just needed warm bodies with skill. And Holliday he certainly had his moments, especially in the month of August when he was in there almost every day. He had that huge pinch hit 3-run double to win that game in August against the Astros. That was a big moment, the grand slam against the Blue Jays. He had that huge late game flipping home run in Toronto later in that series. Like, he had some big swings in August for this Orioles team, and you started to see the spark, and you really saw it in that final game against the Twins. But overall, like, it looked a little better at the end of the year, but he wasn't quite there yet. So the question really is, okay, there now is more of a runway for Holliday to get playing time going into this year. Is he now going to be ready? He just turned 21 in December. He's still young, but he's got 208 big league plate appearances under his feet. Can he take the next step to be at least a league average to above average hitter and really contribute at the plate for the Orioles? We will try to answer that question to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Wonderful Pistachios. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Well, you can crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1-ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they are packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller longer. Now, I know some people love the no shells variety, right? You can just dive into a bag and you don't have to crack them open. Amazing flavors they have. Yeah, those are great. But I still like the classic favorites, the in-shell options. You get the great feeling of cracking it open and getting yourself a delicious, wonderful pistachio and a great protein snack as well. So get snackin' and get crackin' with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. So we head into our final segment, which is what are the biggest storylines for Jackson Holliday heading into his 2025 season. And the first big storyline and big question is second base his job every day, at least at some point this year for the Orioles? And right now, it seems like going into the season, at least against right-handed pitching, it is Jackson Holliday's job at second base. He's been really good, swinging the bat really well so far this spring. That seems to be his position on this team. I think if everybody's healthy against righties, they've marked it with Westberg at third, Gunnar at short, and Jackson Holliday at second. And against righties, again, that is a large majority of the plate appearances. But to take over the job fully, to be the everyday player that the Orioles know he will be as the former number one prospect in baseball, you got to hit lefties. And Gunnar Henderson really struggled to hit lefties early in his career, like 2023, early in the year, down the stretch 2022, like he had his struggles, but then he really turned it on against lefties last year. So it can take a little while. The Orioles allowed him to take his lumps. They didn't play him against all lefties, but they allowed him to take his lumps in certain spots. And it kind of feels like what the Orioles are going to need to do, right? It's a double-edged sword because all we've seen from Holliday is him being almost unplayable against lefties. But he is also the future and potentially present everyday second baseman for this team. And if you're going to be in there every day, you're going to face left-handed pitching. So the O's have to get him at-bats against lefties, but they also don't want to give him too many at-bats against lefties if he's still struggling against them and hurting the team. So it is a delicate balance. The Orioles did well with that balance with Gunnar Henderson, and now that dude mashes lefties and is an MVP candidate. They are hoping for the same for Jackson Holliday. So what I think they will do this year is early in the season, they'll kind of split up the ABs against lefties. Some of them, Jackson Holliday will get the start. Some of them, you'll get Ramon Arias, who hit really well against left-handers last year. He's going to be on this team. Some of them, Arias will be in there, and Holliday will be on the bench. And then as soon as a righty reliever comes out there, Holliday will come in as a pinch hitter. I see them kind of splitting that role early in the season. And a guy like Arias is always going to be important. He showed us that much when he came up big late in the year for the Orioles last year. So they're going to love having him as depth and utility on the bench. But Holliday, at some point, the Orioles are going to hope by the second half of this year that he graduates into truly playing every single day. And guys are going to get injured. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think early on, he kind of splits time against lefties with Arias. Maybe Arias plays a little bit more. And then the O's just kind of ease him in more and more to playing against left-handers. And it's good that even though he was 4 for 40, the Orioles were kind of forced into giving him those chances against lefties late last year. So it's not like he's coming in with nothing on his plate against major league lefties. But I think you play him some against lefties early as you see how it's going. If it's playable, right? If it's not 4 for 40, if it's more 8 for 40 or 10 for 40, then you start to ease him in, play him more and more until he really truly is in there every single day. Now, I think the other big question before we get to the big picture thing for Jackson is, will he have to play some shortstop this year? Because obviously shortstop was Holliday's position when he was drafted and he played there in the minors. But over the last year in the minor leagues, the Orioles knew, hey, we have an MVP type player at shortstop in Gunnar Henderson. We have an opening at second base. That is where Jackson Holliday is going to play. And so they had him play a lot of second in the minor leagues. But I think a shortstop is still in there, and potentially long-term he could play the position. But we got some slightly more concerning news on Gunnar Henderson on Wednesday. Brandon Hyde and the Orioles announced that Henderson officially has a mild right intercostal strain. This was an injury that took him out of the spring training game late last week. The Orioles just called it right side discomfort, said they weren't even going to get an MRI. They said he was improving. Now, Hyde still said Gunnar is improving. And he said, quote, he's very, very hopeful that Gunnar Henderson will still be ready for opening day. But this is a slight setback from what we saw last week. And I think there is, at this point, a bit of a higher chance that Gunnar does start the year on the injured list. And if he does, there is a defensive alignment where the Orioles play Jackson Holliday along with Jordan Westberg, if he's healthy, although he seems a lot closer to potentially even playing later today, getting back in the spring training lineup. But Holliday could have to play some shortstop. That is certainly a possibility. Now, more on the Gunnar Henderson injury tomorrow. We'll jump into that on a news and notes episode tomorrow, but that's potential that Jackson might have to get ready for. Maybe as this spring continues, you're going to see him playing a little more shortstop just to get him ready. But I think the last thing for Holliday really is, will this be the offensive breakout season? He absolutely has the tools. I'm not going to fully judge a guy after 200 plate appearances as a 20-year-old getting kind of forced into the big leagues, especially in that second stint. That's not how I'm going to judge Jackson as a player. If you've already moved on from Jackson Holliday as an all-star level player, that's a you problem. Like, that's 200 plate appearances for 20-year-olds. All right. I think he's going to be fine. He's still got all that same talent. Number one prospect in baseball. And he changed from the big high leg kick to the toe tap last year, similar to what Shohei Ohtani does. Looked really good in that game in Minnesota. Continues to look good this spring. Changed the angle of his bat. It used to be kind of more straight back. Now it's more kind of straight up, which I talked about on an episode a week or so ago. He's also put on a lot of muscle. You can see him. The dude's jacked, at least somewhat more than he was last year in spring training. And also a great story to check out in the Baltimore Banner from Andy Koska on Wednesday. Really good story about Jackson Holliday's speed training that he did with a speed trainer back in Oklahoma this offseason, about how he still got great sprint speed, but Holliday's talked about it. He wants to steal 20-plus bases this season, and he actually worked on his running form and making it even better to increase his speed. So that's going to be a factor here. And for Jackson Holliday, again, we don't have StatCast in every single spring training ballpark, so these numbers are small sample size. But in the games we have for StatCast, Holliday has a 53% hard hit rate in spring training so far this year. Those are Gunnar Henderson numbers for hard hit rates. Like, he is looking so good so far this spring. And projection systems have him around a 110 WRC plus, which would make him about a 10% better than league average hitter with about 500 plate appearances. So that's not an everyday player, but that's a most days player. And somewhere from 2 to 3 WAR over at Fangraphs. If Holliday puts up that season with solid stolen bases and playing good defense at second and maybe a little short, like, I will absolutely take that from a 21-year-old in his first full big league season. But I also think he has the ability to do better than that, because Fangraphs projections have him at like 8 stolen bases. I believe him that the Orioles are going to run more. He's going to run more, and he could steal 20 plus. I think they have him projected for around 12 homers. I think if he plays a lot, he could easily hit 20 home runs this season. Like, I'm high on Holliday going into this year. There's not going to be a lot of pressure. He's going to hit probably 7th or 8th, maybe 6th at the most, but in the bottom third of the order, most likely all the time. There's not going to be a lot of pressure on him to be the star and deliver in that lineup. This lineup's got plenty of stars. This lineup, in terms of position player projected WAR for a team, is number 1 in all of baseball heading into this year, according to Fangraphs. They have so much talent on the position player side. It doesn't have to be a one-man show. And I think we're going to learn a lot about Jackson Holliday this year. And it might not be an all-star level season, but the step forward, he's going to be in there. I think eventually by the end of the year, he takes over every day at second base, and we really start to see that player that was named the number 1 prospect of baseball and was taken number 1 overall and look like a future all-star in this sport. But let me know in the comments section here on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page your thoughts on Jackson Holliday this season, and do you think from day one the Orioles should hand him the second base job every single day, assuming Gunnar Henderson is healthy, or do you think Ramon Urias should be thrown in there a little bit, at least against some lefties? Definitely let me know. But I will be back tomorrow for one more episode this week. Don't worry. We're going to get to basically everything we've missed throughout this week. We'll talk about the spring training games that have happened this week, the ones that have been broadcasted, the ones that have been on StatCast. I got a lot of notes going through those things. We had Albert Suarez starting to look better. We had Grayson Rodriguez with a little velo drop, why I'm not super worried. We'll dive deeper into Gunnar Henderson's injury updates, Jordan Westburg getting back on the field, Andrew Kittredge dealing with a knee issue. He might have to start the year on the IL. What the Orioles will do in that bullpen. Maybe someone like Brian Baker, who's been amazing, could fill into his spot. And we'll also touch on, I think, the big news of the week that I really haven't talked about yet. The Masson dispute is over. What that means for the Orioles on TV and streaming in the years to come. We'll get to all of that coming up on a spring training news and notes episode tomorrow to finish out the week. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.